Marcus Chen stood outside the glass doors of the Sterling Innovation Center, his worn guitar case feeling heavier with each passing second. The building towered above him, all steel and success, a monument to the kind of wealth he could barely imagine. Inside, through those pristine windows, he could see people in expensive suits moving with purpose and confidence. He looked down at his faded jeans and second-hand jacket, suddenly feeling very small. His phone buzzed. Another text from his sister Sarah. "Did you make it? Remember, this is your shot. Don't let them intimidate you." He smiled weakly and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Easy for her to say. She wasn't the one about to walk into a room full of millionaires and investors, hoping they'd see something special in a 26-year-old street performer from the Bronx. Marcus had been playing guitar on subway platforms and street corners for 8 years. He'd learned to read crowds, to know which songs would make people stop and which would make them keep walking. He'd played through rain and snow, through summer heat that made his strings burn his fingers, through winters so cold he couldn't feel his fingertips. He'd collected dollars and quarters in his open guitar case, sometimes making enough for dinner, sometimes going home with empty pockets and an emptier stomach. But 6 months ago, everything changed. A video of him performing an original song called City Heartbeat had gone viral. Someone had filmed him on their phone at the Times Square subway station, and somehow, someway, it had been shared millions of times. The comments were incredible. People from around the world said his music moved them, made them cry, made them feel something real. Record labels started calling. Agents reached out, and then came the invitation that brought him here today. The Sterling Innovation Center was hosting its annual Talent Investment Summit. 20 billionaires and millionaires would gather to hear pitches from artists, inventors, and entrepreneurs. If they liked what they saw, they could invest on the spot, changing someone's life in an instant. Marcus had been invited to perform, to pitch his music as a business opportunity. It felt strange to him, treating his art like a product to be sold, but he needed this. His mother's medical bills were piling up. His sister was working 2 jobs to help support the family, and he was tired of wondering if he'd make enough money each day to afford his next meal. He took a deep breath and pushed through the doors. The lobby was even more impressive inside. Marble floors reflected the light from enormous crystal chandeliers. A young woman in a sharp business suit greeted him at the reception desk. Her smile was professional, but her eyes swept over his appearance with barely concealed judgment. "Name?" she asked, her fingers hovering over her computer keyboard. "Marcus Chen. I'm here for the Talent Summit." She typed quickly, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the keys. "Ah, yes, the musician. You're in conference room A, 3rd floor. The elevator is to your right. Your performance slot is in 45 minutes. Marcus thanked her and headed toward the elevator, feeling the weight of curious stares from the well-dressed professionals in the lobby. He caught his reflection in the polished elevator doors and almost didn't recognize himself. He looked tired, nervous, out of place. He thought about the guitar in his case, the instrument that had been his companion through everything. It wasn't fancy or expensive. He'd bought it at a pawn shop when he was 18, saved up for 3 months working at a burger joint. But it had a sound he loved, a warmth that expensive guitars and music stores somehow lacked. The elevator ride felt both too fast and too slow. When the doors opened on the 3rd floor, he stepped into a hallway lined with photographs of previous summit winners. A tech entrepreneur who'd invented a new solar panel, an artist whose paintings now hung in museums, a chef who'd built a restaurant empire, all of them looking confident and polished in their professional photos, all of them looking nothing like him. He found conference room A and hesitated outside. Through the small window in the door, he could see people already seated, chatting with each other in that easy way wealthy people have. They wore watches that probably cost more than a year of his rent. They carried themselves with the assurance of people who'd never had to worry about their next meal or whether they could afford to fix a broken guitar string. A staff member approached him. "Are you Marcus Chen? You can wait in the green room until it's your turn. Right this door here." The green room was small but comfortable. There was a couch, a mirror, bottles of water, and a fruit basket that probably cost more than Marcus usually spent on groceries in a week. He sat down, opened his guitar case, and ran his fingers over the strings. They needed tuning, as always. He adjusted each one carefully, listening for that perfect pitch. The familiar ritual calmed his nerves slightly. He thought about his mother lying in that hospital bed, trying to smile every time he visited, even though he knew the pain she was in. He thought about Sarah, exhausted from working morning shifts at the diner and evening shifts at the department store. He thought about all the people who'd stopped to listen to him play over the years, who'd dropped money in his case, who'd told him he had something special. A knock at the door made him jump. A different staff member poked her head in. "Mr. Chen, you're up in 5 minutes. We'll come get you when the previous presenter finishes." 5 minutes. He closed his eyes and tried to remember why he was here. Not for the millionaires. Not for the investment. For his family. For his music. For the chance to finally make something of the gift he'd been given. When the door opened again, he stood up, picked up his guitar, and followed the staff member down the hallway. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His palms were sweating. Every instinct told him to turn around and run, to go back to the familiar streets and subway platforms where at least he knew what to expect. But he didn't run. He kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until he reached the door to conference room A. The staff member smiled encouragingly. "Just go in when you're ready. Good luck." Marcus pushed open the door and stepped inside. 20 pairs of eyes turned to look at him. The room fell silent. He saw their expressions change as they took in his appearance, saw the doubt flicker across their faces. Some of them exchanged glances. Others looked down at their phones, already dismissing him. In the center of the room sat a man Marcus recognized from magazine covers. Richard Sterling himself, the billionaire tech mogul who'd founded the Innovation Center. Sterling looked Marcus up and down with an expression that made it clear what he thought of this scruffy street performer who'd somehow wandered into his exclusive event. Marcus walked to the small stage area at the front of the room, his guitar suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. This was it, his one chance. And from the looks on their faces, he'd already lost them before playing a single note. Marcus positioned himself on the small stage, adjusting the microphone stand with trembling hands. The silence in the room was suffocating. He could feel the skepticism radiating from every corner. A woman in the front row was openly checking her watch. A man near the back had his laptop open, clearly planning to work through Marcus's performance. Richard Sterling sat in the center, arms crossed, his face carved from stone. "Whenever you're ready," Sterling said, his tone making it clear he expected this to be a waste of his time. Marcus cleared his throat. "Thank you for having me here today. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've been a street performer for 8 years. A few suppressed smirks rippled through the audience. He saw one investor lean over to whisper something to his neighbor. They both smiled in a way that made Marcus's stomach turn. "I know I probably look different from the other people who've presented today." "That's one way to put it," someone muttered from the back. A few people laughed. Sterling held up his hand for silence, but his expression didn't soften. "Mr. Chen, we've seen your viral video. That's the only reason you're here. But viral moments fade quickly. What we need to understand is why we should invest real money in you. What makes you more than just another internet sensation that'll be forgotten by next week?" The word stung because Marcus had asked himself the same question 1,000 times. "I don't know if I'm more than that," he admitted. "But I know that music has the power to change people's lives because it changed mine. I grew up in a neighborhood where kids had 2 choices, give up or get out. I chose music, and it saved me." A woman in an expensive blue suit raised her hand slightly. "That's very inspiring, Mr. Chen. But we're investors, not a charity. What's your business model? How do you plan to monetize your talent beyond playing for coins on street corners?" Her words felt like a slap, but Marcus forced himself to stay calm. "I've written over 200 original songs. I've built an audience on social media of over 5 million followers across different platforms. I've had interest from 3 record labels, but they want to change my sound, make me into something I'm not. What I need is investment to produce an album independently, to maintain creative control while reaching a wider audience. I've run the numbers." He pulled out a crumpled folder from his guitar case, and he saw several investors exchange amused glances at his lack of professionalism. Streaming revenue, concert bookings, merchandise, licensing for films and commercials. There's a clear path to profitability within 18 months. Sterling leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Chen, I've heard 100 pitches like this. Every artist thinks they're special, thinks their music will change the world. Most of them are wrong. What I want to know is whether you have the discipline, the work ethic, and the business sense to succeed. Because talent alone isn't enough. In fact, in my experience, talent is often the least important ingredient. The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He'd spent his entire life working on his talent, perfecting his craft, believing that if he was just good enough, opportunities would come. But standing here in front of these millionaires, he realized they didn't care about his years of practice, his calloused fingers, the cold nights when he'd played until his hands went numb. They cared about spreadsheets and profit margins and return on investment. "You're right," Marcus said quietly. "Talent isn't enough. I've known incredibly talented musicians who gave up because they couldn't handle the business side. I've seen people with less ability succeed because they understood the industry better." He paused, gathering his courage. "But here's what I believe. Music isn't just a business. It's how people make sense of their lives. It's what they listen to when they're heartbroken, when they fall in love, when they need courage to face another day. And if you treat it only as a product, only as a way to make money, then you've missed the entire point." The room grew even quieter. Sterling's expression was unreadable. Marcus knew he was probably ending any chance he had at investment, but the words kept coming. "I don't expect charity. I'm offering a business opportunity, but I'm also offering something that can't be measured on a spreadsheet. I'm offering music that actually means something to people. And maybe, in a world where everything is calculated and optimized and focus grouped, that's exactly what people are desperate for." A man in the third row spoke up, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's a beautiful speech, kid. Very moving. But I invest in results, not feelings. What happens when the viral moment fades and nobody cares about your meaningful music anymore? What happens when the next young artist with a sob story comes along and takes your audience?" Marcus felt his face flush. The word kid felt deliberately insulting. The dismissal of his background as just a sob story made anger bubble up in his chest. But he forced himself to breathe, to think before responding. "You're right to be skeptical. The music industry is brutal, and most artists fail. But the ones who succeed aren't always the most talented. They're the ones who refuse to quit, who adapt without losing themselves, who build genuine connections with their audience. I've been building those connections for 8 years, one listener at a time. That doesn't disappear overnight." Sterling stood up suddenly, and Marcus's heart sank. He assumed the billionaire was about to leave to end this humiliation early. But instead, Sterling walked toward the stage, his expensive shoes clicking on the polished floor. "Mr. Chen, you've given us a lot of talk about passion and meaning and connection. But talk is cheap. Every artist who stood in this room has had the same speech about how special they are, how different their music is." He stopped a few feet from Marcus, his eyes cold and challenging. "So here's what I want to know. Can you actually play? Or is that guitar just a prop to complete your street performer image?" The room erupted in murmurs. Marcus felt his face burn with shame and anger. He wanted to shout at Sterling, to tell him exactly what he thought of his arrogance and cruelty. But he also knew that's what Sterling wanted, to provoke him into losing his temper and proving he didn't belong here. Instead, Marcus looked Sterling directly in the eye. "I can play." "Then prove it," Sterling said, returning to his seat. "No more speeches. No more explanations. Just play something that justifies why we should take you seriously." Marcus stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He'd prepared a specific song for this presentation, one he thought would appeal to investors, something upbeat and commercial. But looking at these faces, at their doubt and dismissal and barely concealed contempt, he knew that playing it safe wouldn't work. They'd already written him off. He adjusted his guitar and made a decision. He would play something real, something raw, something that showed them exactly who he was. If they rejected him after that, at least they'd be rejecting the truth, not some watered-down version he thought they wanted to hear. "This song is called Invisible People," he said softly into the microphone. "I wrote it 3 years ago, after a night when I played for 4 hours on the subway and made $11. I watched thousands of people walk past me that night, and I realized something. They weren't ignoring me because my music was bad. They were ignoring me because I was invisible to them. Just another person they didn't have to notice or think about." He saw some uncomfortable shifting in the seats. Good. He wanted them uncomfortable. He positioned his fingers on the frets and began to play. The first notes filled the conference room, soft and haunting. Marcus's fingers moved across the strings with the confidence of someone who'd played this song hundreds of times. Each performance a small act of survival. The melody was simple at first, almost deceptively so, like a lullaby or a folk song passed down through generations. But there was something underneath it, a complexity in the chord progressions that hinted at deeper currents running beneath the surface. Then Marcus began to sing, and the room transformed. His voice was nothing like what the investors expected. It wasn't polished or perfectly trained. There was a roughness to it, a texture earned from years of singing on cold street corners and in echoing subway tunnels. But it was authentic in a way that cut through all their expectations and prejudices. It was the voice of someone who'd actually lived the words he was singing. You walk past me every day, eyes straight ahead, got no time to look my way. I'm just scenery in your scene, another face you've never seen. But I've got stories, I've got dreams, I've got a life more real than it seems. The woman who'd been checking her watch had stopped. Her hand was frozen halfway to her wrist. Her attention suddenly captured. The man with the laptop had paused his typing, his fingers hovering above the keys as if he'd forgotten what he was about to write. Even Sterling, with his practiced expression of indifference, had leaned forward almost imperceptibly in his seat. Marcus closed his eyes as he sang, losing himself in the music the way he always did. In his mind, he wasn't in this sterile conference room surrounded by judgment and wealth. He was back in the subway, watching the endless stream of humanity flow past him. He saw the tired faces of people coming home from jobs they hated, the excited tourists snapping photos of everything except him, the children who'd paused to listen before their parents pulled them away. He saw himself in that moment feeling so small and insignificant, wondering if anyone would ever really see him. I'm the invisible people, living in your world, but never really here. I'm the invisible people singing songs you'll never hear, until the day you stop and see that invisible people are just like you and me. The melody shifted, becoming more complex. Marcus's fingers flew across the fretboard, adding layers of harmony that shouldn't have been possible on a single guitar. This was his gift, the thing that had always set him apart. He could make one instrument sound like an entire orchestra, could coax emotions from strings that professional musicians with expensive equipment struggled to achieve. A woman in the second row had tears streaming down her face. She wasn't even trying to hide them. The man sitting next to her had pulled out his phone, but not to check messages or work. He was recording Marcus's performance, wanting to capture this moment. Others were doing the same. Phone cameras pointed at the stage, all thoughts of spreadsheets and profit margins temporarily forgotten. Sterling's expression had changed. The cold skepticism was still there, but something else had crept in around the edges. Recognition, perhaps. Or maybe just surprise that this scruffy street performer could actually deliver on his promises. His arms were no longer crossed. He was leaning forward in his seat, one hand on his chin, completely focused on the performance unfolding before him. Marcus opened his eyes and looked directly at Sterling as he sang the bridge. You built your wall so high and strong, convinced yourself you don't belong to the same world where people fall, but your walls are just another way to hide from the truth that's living deep inside, that we're all invisible after all. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Several of the investors shifted uncomfortably. Marcus was calling them out, challenging their comfortable lives and their assumption that they were fundamentally different from people like him. It was a risky move, possibly career-ending, but it was honest. And right now, honesty was the only weapon he had. The song built toward its climax, Marcus's voice growing stronger and more powerful. He wasn't just performing anymore. He was testifying, bearing witness to all the struggles and defeats and small victories he'd experienced. Every late night when he'd questioned whether he should give up. Every morning when he'd woken up and chosen to keep going. Every person who'd walked past without stopping. And every rare soul who'd paused to listen and made him feel seen. So when you walk past me today, maybe you'll stop along the way. Maybe you'll see what I can be if someone just believes in me. We're all the invisible people, trying to be heard and trying to be found. We're all the invisible people, making our small corner of sound. The final notes resonated through the room, hanging in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Marcus let them fade naturally, not rushing to fill the silence. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He'd poured everything he had into that performance, held nothing back. Now there was nothing to do but wait for their verdict. The silence stretched on. Marcus could hear someone breathing heavily, emotion caught in their throat. He could hear the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. He could hear the distant sound of traffic from the street below. But nobody in the room spoke. They just stared at him, and he couldn't read their expressions. Was it appreciation, pity, embarrassment for him? Finally, Sterling stood up. His face was still difficult to read, but something had shifted in his demeanor. He walked toward the stage again, and this time Marcus noticed that his steps were slower, more thoughtful. When he reached the front of the room, he stopped and looked up at Marcus with an expression that might have been respect, or might have been calculation. With men like Sterling, it was always hard to tell. "That was unexpected," Sterling said, his voice quiet but carrying through the room. "I've sat through dozens of these presentations, heard hundreds of pitches from artists and entrepreneurs and inventors, all of them telling me why they deserve my money. Most of them are polished and professional. They have perfect presentations, beautiful slides, carefully rehearsed speeches. They tell me exactly what they think I want to hear." He paused, and Marcus braced himself for the criticism he knew was coming. This was the moment when Sterling would acknowledge that the performance was moving, but ultimately not a good investment. When he'd explain, in that patronizing way wealthy people had, that business decisions couldn't be made based on emotions. But Sterling surprised him. "You did none of that," he continued. "You came in here looking like you'd just rolled off the street. Your pitch was clumsy. Your business plan was printed on wrinkled paper. You challenged us, accused us of building walls and hiding from reality. By every conventional measure, this should have been a disaster of a presentation." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Here it came. The rejection. He'd known it was coming, had prepared himself for it, but it still hurt more than he expected. He thought about his mother in the hospital, about Sarah working herself to exhaustion, about all the people who'd believed in him and told him this was his chance. "But here's the thing," Sterling said, and his voice had changed somehow, become less formal, more human. "In 30 years of business, I've learned that conventional measures often miss what actually matters. Numbers can be manipulated. Presentations can be polished. Market research can be manufactured. But authenticity?" He shook his head slowly. "That can't be faked. And what I just heard was the most authentic thing I've experienced in this room in 5 years of running this summit." A murmur ran through the crowd. Marcus felt dizzy, unsure if he was understanding correctly. Was Sterling saying what he thought he was saying? "You're right about us," Sterling continued, and now he was speaking not just to Marcus but to the entire room. "We do build walls. We convince ourselves we're different from people struggling on the streets. We measure success in dollars and cents and forget that the most valuable things in life can't be counted on a spreadsheet." You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. He turned to address the other investors. 20 years ago, before the tech company, before the billions, I was playing piano in hotel lounges for $50 a night. I'd studied at Juilliard, had dreams of being a concert pianist, but I couldn't make ends meet. I told myself I was giving up on music to be practical, to build something sustainable. But the truth is I gave up because I was scared. Scared that my talent wasn't enough. Scared that I'd always be invisible, just like Marcus described. The room was absolutely silent now. This was clearly not something Sterling talked about often. Marcus saw the other investors leaning forward, shocked to hear their intimidating host revealing vulnerability. Sterling's confession hung in the air like smoke. Marcus watched as this powerful billionaire, this man who'd built empires and commanded respect in every room he entered, allowed his carefully constructed armor to crack. The other investors looked uncomfortable, unused to seeing their host display such raw honesty. Some shifted in their seats, others stared down at their hands, but everyone was listening. "I built my tech company," Sterling continued, "and I told myself I was happy. I made more money than I'd ever dreamed of. I bought houses and cars and all the status symbols that prove you've succeeded. But there were nights when I'd walk past a piano in one of my homes and I couldn't bring myself to touch it, because touching it would remind me of what I'd given up, of the music I'd decided wasn't worth fighting for." He turned back to Marcus. "When I watched your viral video 6 months ago, something in it bothered me. I couldn't figure out what it was at first. The song was good, your technique was impressive, but that wasn't it. Then I realized you were playing like someone who had nothing to lose, like someone who'd chosen the hard path and refused to compromise. And that bothered me because I'd chosen the easy path, the safe path, and I'd spent 20 years telling myself it was the smart decision." Marcus didn't know what to say. He'd walked into this room expecting judgment and dismissal. Instead, he was witnessing something he hadn't anticipated: recognition. Not just of his talent, but of the choices he'd made, the struggles he'd endured. Sterling understood because he'd stood at the same crossroads once and taken the other road. "That's why I invited you here today. Sterling said. Not because I thought you'd be a good investment, though that might be true. I invited you because I wanted to see if you were real. I wanted to know if that authenticity I saw in the video was genuine, or just another carefully crafted image designed to manipulate people's emotions. And I'll be honest, I was hoping you'd be fake, because if you were real, it would mean I'd have to face some uncomfortable truths about myself. A woman in the front row found her voice. Her name was Catherine Mills, Marcus remembered from the program. She owned a chain of luxury hotels and had a reputation for being as tough as Sterling himself. Richard, are you saying you're investing in Mr. Chen? Sterling smiled, but it wasn't his usual confident smile. This one was tinged with something that looked almost like regret. I'm saying that Mr. Chen has reminded me why I started this summit in the first place. It wasn't to make more money. It wasn't to find the next profitable venture. It was to give people with genuine talent and passion a chance to succeed without having to compromise who they are. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. We turned this into just another business transaction, another opportunity to maximize returns. He looked around at the other investors. How many brilliant artists and inventors and entrepreneurs have we passed over because they didn't fit our narrow definition of a good investment? How many Marcus Chens have we dismissed because they didn't have the polish and presentation we expected? We've been so focused on the numbers that we've forgotten to look for the actual value these people bring to the world. Marcus watched as Sterling's words began to sink in. Some investors were nodding thoughtfully. Others still looked skeptical, their faces betraying their belief that business and emotion shouldn't mix. But something was shifting in the room, a subtle change in atmosphere that Marcus could feel but not quite name. A man in the back row stood up. Marcus recognized him as James Holloway, a venture capitalist who'd made billions investing in startups. With all due respect, Richard, I think you're letting emotion cloud your judgment. Yes, Mr. Chen's performance was moving. Yes, his story is compelling. But that doesn't change the fundamental business reality. The music industry is saturated. The odds of success are minimal. And investing based on feelings rather than data is how fortunes get lost. Several other investors murmured in agreement. Marcus felt his brief moment of hope starting to crumble. Of course they wouldn't invest. Why had he allowed himself to believe for even a second that one performance could change minds that were made up before he'd even walked through the door? But Sterling didn't back down. You're absolutely right, James. The music industry is difficult and the failure rate is high. But tell me something. When you made your first major investment, the one that built your fortune, did you do it because the data was perfect? Or did you do it because you saw something in that entrepreneur that the data couldn't capture? Some spark, some determination, some vision that made you believe they'd succeed against the odds? Holloway hesitated, and in that hesitation, Marcus saw the truth. Every successful investor in this room had, at some point, made a decision that defied logic, that went against the numbers, that came down to trusting their instinct about a person. Sterling pressed his advantage. We all remember those moments. The investments that made us who we are weren't the safe bets or the guaranteed returns. They were the risks we took on people who everyone else had written off. And yes, some of those risks didn't pan out, but the ones that did, they changed everything. Catherine Mills stood up and Marcus held his breath. She had a reputation for being even more ruthless than Holloway. But when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than dismissive. Richard is right about one thing. We have become too focused on predictability, too cautious, too willing to pass on opportunities that don't fit our algorithms and models. She looked at Marcus. Mr. Chen, your performance was exceptional. More than that, it was genuine in a way that's rare in any industry. Not just music. But I need to know something before I'd consider investing. Marcus nodded for her to continue, his heart racing. Can you handle success? She asked bluntly. Because success is often harder than failure. Failure teaches you resilience. Success tests your character in ways you can't anticipate. You've spent 8 years being invisible, being overlooked, being underestimated. What happens when suddenly everyone wants a piece of you? When record labels are fighting for you instead of dismissing you? When you have money and fame and all the temptations that come with them? Will you stay true to the artist you are now? Or will you become just another cautionary tale about someone who couldn't handle the spotlight? The question hit Marcus harder than any criticism had, because it was something he'd wondered about himself during the long, lonely nights when success seemed impossible. It was easy to say you wouldn't compromise when you had nothing. But what about when everything you dreamed of was finally within reach? How many artists had started out authentic and real, only to be gradually worn down by the industry until they became hollow versions of themselves? I don't know, Marcus said honestly. I'd like to think I'd stay true to who I am. I'd like to believe that success wouldn't change me. But I've never been tested that way, so I can't make promises I'm not sure I can keep. He paused, choosing his words carefully. What I can tell you is this. The music I make comes from my life, from my experiences, from the struggles I've faced. If I lose that connection, if I let success turn me into something fake and manufactured, then I'll have nothing left to say. And if I have nothing left to say, the music dies anyway. He looked around the room at all these wealthy, powerful people who held his future in their hands. So maybe the real question isn't whether I can handle success. Maybe it's whether success can handle me staying exactly who I am. A few people laughed, but it was genuine laughter, not mocking. Sterling was smiling now, a real smile that reached his eyes. That's the answer of someone who might actually make it, he said. Another investor stood up, a younger man named David Park who'd made his fortune in social media marketing. I've been analyzing your numbers while you've been talking. 5 million followers across platforms is impressive, but the engagement rate is what really stands out. Your audience isn't passive. They're commenting, sharing, creating content around your music. That's organic growth, not bought followers or artificial inflation. From a pure marketing perspective, you're sitting on a gold mine that most record labels would kill for. Marcus felt the energy in the room shifting again. More investors were pulling out their phones, looking up his social media profiles, checking his numbers. He could see the moment when their perception changed, when he went from being a charity case to being a potential opportunity. It should have felt like victory, but instead it felt strange, like he was being evaluated and measured rather than seen as a person. Here's what I propose, Sterling said, taking control of the room again. We do something different today. Instead of a traditional investment where Mr. Chen gives up control in exchange for funding, we offer him a grant. No strings attached, no ownership stake, just the money he needs to produce his album his way, plus resources and connections to help him navigate the industry. If he succeeds, we've helped launch something meaningful. If he fails, we've still made a statement about what we value. The room erupted in conversation. Investors were talking over each other, some agreeing with Sterling, others arguing against the unorthodox approach. Marcus stood on the stage feeling like he was watching his life being debated by people who didn't really know him. Holloway's voice cut through the chaos. Richard, you're letting sentiment override business sense. A grant with no equity stake? That's not an investment. That's charity dressed up in expensive clothes. And it sets a terrible precedent. Every artist who comes through here will expect the same treatment. Then maybe they should, Sterling shot back. Maybe we've been doing this wrong from the start. Maybe the point of wealth isn't to accumulate more of it, but to give people opportunities we never had. Easy for you to say, another investor called out. You've already made your billions. Some of us are still building our portfolios. We can't afford to give away money on feel-good gestures that might make us sleep better at night but won't generate returns. Catherine Mills raised her hand for silence, and gradually the room quieted. I think we're missing the middle ground here. Richard, your instinct to help Mr. Chen is admirable, but James is right that a pure grant isn't sustainable as a business model. On the other hand, James, you're wrong that this has to be a traditional equity deal. She turned to Marcus. What if we offered you a loan with extremely favorable terms? Low interest, flexible repayment schedule tied to revenue rather than fixed dates. You maintain full creative control and ownership. We get our money back if you succeed, but we're not taking a piece of your future. Marcus felt his head spinning. They were negotiating his future while he stood there like a piece of property being discussed by potential buyers. Part of him wanted to interrupt, to remind them that he was a person with his own thoughts and feelings about all of this. But another part of him recognized that this was how business worked at this level. Decisions got made in rooms like this. Deals got structured by people with power and experience. He could either accept it or walk away with nothing. That's a reasonable compromise, David Park said. And it addresses the concern about precedent. We're not just giving money away, but we're also not demanding the kind of control that might compromise the authenticity we're all supposedly valuing so highly. More investors were nodding now. Marcus could see the tide turning, see them moving toward agreement, but something didn't feel right. He thought about what Catherine had asked him earlier, about whether he could handle success. He thought about all the artists he'd known who'd signed deals that seemed great at first, but turned into nightmares later. And he realized that if he didn't speak up now, if he let these powerful people make all the decisions, he'd be starting his new career by proving he was exactly as powerless as they assumed. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the discussion. The room fell silent, surprised that he was inserting himself into their debate. "I appreciate everything you're saying, and I'm grateful for your consideration. But I need to be honest about something." Sterling raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Marcus took a deep breath. "This doesn't feel right. You're talking about me like I'm not in the room, like my opinion doesn't matter in deciding my own future, and I understand why. You have the money and the power, and I'm just a street performer who got lucky with a viral video. But if I accept help on those terms, if I let you structure my career while I stand here silently grateful, then I'm already compromising who I am." He could see some investors rolling their eyes, but he pressed on. "When I was 11 years old, my father left, just walked out one day and never came back. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us fed and housed. I watched her come home exhausted every night, watched her sacrifice everything for me and my sister. And the one thing she always told us was this: never let anyone make you feel like you should be grateful for basic respect. Never accept crumbs and act like it's a feast." Marcus looked directly at Sterling. "What you're offering sounds generous. A loan with good terms, resources and connections, a chance to make my music my way. But you know what it actually is? It's you deciding what I need and how I should get it, without asking me what I actually want. It's benevolent control disguised as opportunity." The room had gone completely silent. Marcus could see shock on some faces, anger on others. Holloway was shaking his head like Marcus had just made the stupidest mistake of his life. But Sterling's expression was harder to read. He was studying Marcus with intense focus, like a chess player who just encountered an unexpected move. "So what do you want?" Sterling asked quietly. Marcus set his guitar down carefully, buying himself a moment to think. This was it. He could either play it safe, apologize for his outburst, and accept whatever they offered, or he could take the biggest risk of his life and demand to be treated as an equal partner in his own future. "I want to know why you really brought me here," Marcus said. "Not the official reason, the real one. Because I don't believe it was just to invest in my music. You could have done that with a phone call, sent me a check in the mail if you wanted to help. But instead you invited me to perform in front of 20 millionaires and billionaires. You made me stand here and prove myself while you sat in judgment. Why?" Sterling's face remained impassive, but Marcus saw something flicker in his eyes. "Recognition, maybe. Or respect. You think you know why?" "I think you wanted to see if I'd break," Marcus said. "I think you wanted to test whether I'd compromise myself to get what I need. Because that's what this whole summit is really about, isn't it? You don't just invest in talent or business models. You invest in people who remind you of yourself, people who have the same hunger you had, the same willingness to do whatever it takes to succeed." He gestured around the room. "Everyone here has money and power now, but you all started somewhere else. You all had moments when you had to choose between staying true to yourself and taking the easier path. And I think you want to see if I'll make the same choices you did. The question is, are you hoping I'll compromise like you did? Or are you hoping I'll be stronger than you were?" The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus had crossed a line, had challenged not just Sterling but every person in the room. He'd essentially accused them all of selling out, of building their fortunes on compromises they weren't proud of. It was possibly the dumbest thing he could have done, but it was also the most honest. Sterling stood up slowly. His face was still unreadable, but his body language had changed. He walked toward Marcus with measured steps, and Marcus braced himself for the rejection he'd just earned. When Sterling reached the stage, he looked up at Marcus for a long moment. Then he started to laugh. Not the polite chuckle of someone being diplomatic, but a real, genuine laugh that seemed to surprise even him. "You arrogant, insightful, absolutely correct young man," he said, shaking his head. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Marcus felt his stomach drop. "I probably just talked myself out of any chance at investment." "Oh, you definitely did that," Sterling agreed. "At least half the people in this room think you're an ungrateful fool who just bit the hand that was trying to feed him. They'll never invest in you now, no matter how talented you are." He paused, his smile widening. "But the other half? They're realizing they just watched someone with absolutely nothing to fall back on tell a room full of billionaires that their money isn't enough, that their terms aren't acceptable. That being treated like an equal matters more than being given an opportunity." He turned to address the room. How many of us would have had the courage to do that when we were starting out? How many of us did do that? Catherine Mills was smiling now too. I tried to negotiate my first business deal from a position of strength even though I was desperate and they knew it. They laughed me out of the room. I ended up having to accept their terms, and it took me 5 years to recover from that contract. I've always wondered what would have happened if I'd walked away instead. David Park nodded. I gave up equity in my first company that I spent the next decade regretting. I told myself I had no choice, that I needed their investment to survive. But the truth is I was scared. Scared to trust myself, scared to hold out for better terms. Other investors were sharing similar stories now. The facade of invincibility was cracking, revealing the uncertainty and fear and regret that lived beneath all the success. Marcus realized that Sterling had been right about one thing. These people did see themselves in him. Not because he was like them now, but because he reminded them of who they used to be before the compromises and calculations and carefully controlled public images. Sterling turned back to Marcus. Here's what's going to happen. I'm not going to offer you a grant or a loan or any kind of traditional investment structure. Instead, I'm going to make you a promise. I'll fund your album, cover all production costs, connect you with the best studios and producers. You'll maintain complete creative control and full ownership of your music. In exchange, you'll give me nothing. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. I don't understand. Neither do I entirely, Sterling admitted. But here's what I do know. 20 years ago, I had talent and dreams and the courage to pursue them. Then I got scared and chose safety over passion. I've built an empire, yes. I've achieved success beyond my wildest expectations. But there's a piano in my home that I haven't touched in 15 years because every time I look at it, I remember what I gave up. Sterling's words hung in the air, heavy with emotion that seemed to surprise even him. Marcus watched as this powerful man allowed himself to be vulnerable in front of his peers, exposing regrets he'd probably never spoken aloud before. The other investors sat transfixed, witnessing a moment they sensed was significant not just for Marcus, but for their host as well. I can't get those years back, Sterling continued, his voice quieter now. I can't undo the choice I made to abandon music for business. But maybe I can do something else. Maybe I can make sure that someone with real talent and genuine courage doesn't have to make the same choice. Maybe that's worth more than any return on investment. Holloway stood up, his face flushed. Richard, this is insanity. You're letting emotion completely override logic. Yes, the kid's got talent. Yes, his story is moving. But you're talking about funding his entire album with no expectation of return. That's not business, that's not even smart charity. That's just throwing money at your own regrets and hoping it makes you feel better. You're absolutely right, Sterling said, surprising everyone by agreeing. It is about my regrets. It is emotional rather than logical. But tell me something, James. When you die, what do you want to be remembered for? The size of your portfolio? The returns you generated? Or the impact you had on the world? Holloway opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The question had clearly caught him off guard. Sterling looked around the room. We've all made more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. We come to these summits pretending we're looking for good investments, but what we're really looking for is meaning, some way to prove that our success was about more than just accumulating wealth. We want to believe we're making a difference, that we're helping talented people succeed. But how often do we actually take a real risk on someone? How often do we give without expecting anything in return? Catherine Mills stood up, pulling out her checkbook. Richard, you're going to make me do something I'll probably regret. But you're right. We've become too cautious, too focused on protecting what we have rather than using it for something meaningful. She looked at Marcus. I'll match Richard's contribution. Whatever it costs to produce your album, we'll split it 50-50. And like Richard said, you owe us nothing in return. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. He tried to speak but couldn't find words. This was beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd walked through those doors. Not just financial support, but genuine belief from people who had no reason to believe in him. David Park was tapping on his phone. I'm not investing money, but I'm committing my company's resources. Marketing strategy, social media management, brand development. My team will work with you for free for the first year. You'll have professional support without having to pay for it or give up control. Another investor stood up, then another. Within minutes, Marcus had commitments not just for funding, but for legal support, distribution connections, studio time, even housing in New York so he could work without worrying about rent. The room had transformed from a place of judgment to a place of possibility. People who'd walked in as skeptics were now competing to offer support. But not everyone was convinced. Holloway and 3 other investors had moved to the back of the room, talking in low, angry voices. Marcus could see their disapproval radiating across the space. They thought Sterling was being foolish. That emotion had clouded his judgment that this whole situation was setting a terrible precedent. And maybe they were right. Maybe this was just a wealthy man trying to buy redemption for his past choices. But standing there watching these powerful people commit their resources to his dream, Marcus decided he didn't care about their motivations. He cared about the opportunity they were offering. Sterling walked up to the stage and extended his hand. Marcus took it and they shook firmly. "I have 2 conditions," Sterling said. "First, you never compromise your music to please anyone, including me. The moment you start making creative decisions based on what you think people want, rather than what you genuinely want to create, this deal is done. I'm not funding a product. I'm funding an artist." Marcus nodded, his throat still too tight to speak. "Second," Sterling continued, 10 years from now, when you're successful and established, I want you to do something similar for someone else. Find a talented person who's being overlooked or dismissed. Give them the opportunity they deserve without expecting anything in return. Pass this forward. That's the only repayment I want. I promise," Marcus managed to say, his voice cracking with emotion. Sterling smiled. "Good. Now get off my stage and go make something amazing." The room erupted in applause. Even some of the skeptical investors were clapping, caught up in the moment despite their reservations. Marcus carefully packed his guitar, his hands shaking. He felt like he was in a dream, like at any moment he'd wake up back in his tiny apartment, with sirens wailing outside and no idea how he'd pay next month's rent. As the other investors came up to introduce themselves and exchange contact information, Marcus noticed Holloway approaching. The venture capitalist's face was stern, and Marcus braced himself for criticism or a lecture about how he'd manipulated the situation with his sob story. But Holloway surprised him. "You've got guts, kid. Calling us out like that could have backfired spectacularly. Probably should have, honestly. But you read the room right and you stood your ground." He pulled out a business card. "I'm not investing in your music. I think Richard's making an emotional decision that's going to cost him money he'll never see again. But I am impressed by your courage and your business instinct. If you ever want to expand beyond music into other ventures, call me. Not for a handout, but for a real business partnership." Marcus took the card, stunned. "Thank you. I think," Holloway laughed. "You should thank me. I'm the only one here treating you like a businessman instead of a charity case. Remember that when the warm feelings fade and you have to actually deliver results." He walked away, leaving Marcus to ponder his words. Catherine Mills approached next, and her message was different but equally challenging. "You've been given an incredible opportunity," she said. "But opportunity without preparation is just another path to failure. You'll need to learn the business side of music fast. You'll need to understand contracts, royalties, licensing, publishing rights. The industry will try to take advantage of you, and good intentions from us won't protect you from your own ignorance." She handed him a folder. "These are the names of 3 lawyers who specialize in entertainment law. All of them are honest, which is rare in this business. Pick one and have them review every document you sign, every agreement you make. I'll pay their fees for the first year. After that, you're on your own." "Why are you helping me?" Marcus asked. "Not just the money, the advice, the connections. What do you get out of this?" Catherine smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "When I was starting out, a woman named Ruth Morrison gave me my first break. She invested in my hotel concept when every bank had turned me down. She mentored me, taught me how to navigate a business world that wasn't designed for women. She asked for nothing in return except that I do the same for someone else when I could." "Did you?" Marcus asked. "Not as often as I should have," Catherine admitted. "I got caught up in building my empire, in proving I belonged in rooms full of powerful men. I forgot Ruth's lesson about using success to lift others up. Your performance today reminded me of that, so thank you for that reminder, and don't waste it." As more investors came up to offer support and advice, Marcus began to understand the complexity of what was happening. This wasn't just about him or his music. It was about each of these successful people confronting their own choices, their own regrets, their own understanding of what success really meant. He was the catalyst for something larger than himself, and that realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Sterling appeared at his side again, this time with a practical focus. "We should talk logistics. You'll need to start making decisions about producers, studios, session musicians. I have contacts who can help. But remember the first condition. Every creative decision is yours. I'm opening doors, not pushing you through them." Marcus nodded, his mind already racing ahead to all the choices he'd need to make. What songs would go on the album? What sound was he going for? Who should he work with? The freedom was exhilarating and overwhelming in equal measure. "There's something else," Sterling said, lowering his voice. "The media will find out about this. Probably within a day or two. They'll turn it into a story about a billionaire giving money to a poor street musician. They'll make it saccharine and simple, strip away all the complexity of what actually happened here. You need to be ready for that." "Ready how?" Marcus asked. "Ready to control your own narrative," Sterling said. "Don't let them turn you into a victim who was rescued by generous rich people. You earned this opportunity by being talented and brave enough to be yourself. The money is just resources. The real gift is the chance to maintain your artistic integrity while having access to professional support. Make sure that's the story that gets told." 3 hours later, Marcus stood on the sidewalk outside the Sterling Innovation Center, his guitar case in hand, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street, and he realized he'd been inside for most of the day. It felt like a lifetime ago that he'd stood on this same spot, terrified and uncertain, convinced he was about to be humiliated. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Well, did they laugh you out of the building? Should I get the ice cream ready for a comfort food binge?" Marcus smiled and called her instead of texting back. She answered on the first ring. "That bad, huh? I'm sorry, Marcus. I really thought this could be your break." "Sarah," he said, his voice shaky, "they're funding my album, all of it. And I don't have to give them anything in return." The line went silent for so long he thought the call had dropped. Then he heard his sister crying. "Are you serious? This isn't a joke? Because if you're messing with me right now, I swear I'll—" "It's real," Marcus said, tears streaming down his own face. "It's all real. We can pay Mom's medical bills. You can quit one of your jobs. I can actually make music without wondering if I'll eat that day. It's real, Sarah." They both cried then, not bothering to hide it, letting 8 years of struggle and sacrifice and barely holding on pour out in tears of relief and joy and disbelief. People walking past gave Marcus strange looks, but he didn't care. His whole life had just changed, and he needed this moment to feel real before he could begin to process what came next. After he hung up with Sarah, promising to come home and tell her everything in person, Marcus started walking. He wasn't sure where he was going. He just needed to move, to feel his feet on the ground, to prove to himself that this wasn't a dream he'd wake up from in his cramped apartment. He found himself heading toward the subway station where he'd performed the night his viral video was recorded. It was rush hour now, the platform crowded with tired commuters heading home. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd and watched them, really watched them in a way he hadn't in a long time. Each person carrying their own struggles and dreams and stories. Each person invisible to most of the others, just faces in a crowd. He thought about the song he'd performed that day, Invisible People. It had felt true when he wrote it, a reflection of his own experience of being overlooked and dismissed. But standing here now with his future suddenly secure, he wondered if he'd still be able to write songs like that. Would success make him forget what it felt like to be invisible? Would financial security dull the edge that made his music authentic? Catherine's warning echoed in his mind. Can you handle success? Sterling's condition resonated even louder. Never compromise your music to please anyone. Both of them understood that the real challenge wasn't getting the opportunity. It was staying true to himself once he had it. A street performer was set up at the far end of the platform. A young woman with a violin playing Bach. Her case was open in front of her with a few scattered dollar bills. Most people walked past without looking. A few paused to listen for a moment before moving on. She was talented, Marcus could hear that even from a distance, but talent alone wasn't enough. He'd proven that truth today. Talent got you noticed, maybe. But it was courage, authenticity, and a little bit of luck that opened doors. Marcus walked over to her case and pulled out his wallet. He placed $500 bills inside, all the cash he had on him. The violinist looked up in shock, her bow stuttering to a stop mid-phrase. Thank you. That's incredibly generous. Keep playing, Marcus said. Don't stop for people like me. The ones who matter will stop for the music, not the money in your case. She nodded slowly, studying his face like she was trying to understand who he was and why he'd done this. Then she lifted her violin and began to play again, her music filling the subway platform with beauty that most people were too busy to notice. Marcus found a bench and sat down, pulled out his phone and started making notes. Song ideas were flooding his mind faster than he could capture them. He thought about Sterling's regrets, about Catherine's mentor, Ruth Morrison, about Holloway's warning that opportunity without preparation was just another path to failure. He thought about his mother in the hospital and Sarah working herself to exhaustion in all the years of struggle that had led to this moment. And he thought about the responsibility that came with this gift he'd been given. Sterling had asked him to pay it forward in 10 years, to find someone talented who was being overlooked and give them a chance. But Marcus knew he couldn't wait 10 years. He needed to start now while he still remembered what it felt like to be invisible, while he still understood the desperation of not knowing if your dreams would ever come true. He pulled up his bank account on his phone. The deposits hadn't hit yet, of course. Those would take time to process, contracts to sign, logistics to work out, but they were coming. Money that would change his life, that would lift the crushing weight of financial stress that had been his constant companion for 8 years. Marcus made a decision. When the money came through, he'd set aside a portion of it for other artists. Not a huge amount, not enough to jeopardize his own stability or his family's needs, but enough to help 10 or 15 street performers like that violinist. Enough to cover guitar repairs or new strings or the difference between eating and going hungry for artists who were where he'd been just this morning. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Hello? Marcus Chen? This is Jennifer Walsh from the New York Times. I heard about what happened at the Sterling Innovation Summit today, and I'd love to interview you for a piece I'm writing about alternative funding models for artists. Do you have time to talk? It had started already. The media attention Sterling had warned him about. The story spinning out into the world, being shaped and reshaped by people who hadn't been in that room, who hadn't felt the weight of that moment. Marcus thought about what Sterling had said about controlling his own narrative. I can talk, Marcus said, but I want to be clear about something first. This isn't a story about a rich man rescuing a poor musician. This is a story about what happens when people with resources decide to value authenticity over return on investment. It's a story about second chances and paying forward the opportunities you've received. If you're going to write about me, that's the story I want told. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's a much more interesting angle than the one I was planning. Can we meet tomorrow? I'd like to hear the whole story directly from you. They scheduled a time and place, and Marcus hung up feeling like he'd just won a small but important victory. The media would tell their story however they wanted ultimately, but at least he'd tried to shape it, to make sure the truth wasn't buried under sentimentality and simplified narratives. The violinist was packing up now, rush hour ending, the crowd thinning out. She glanced over at Marcus and gave him a small wave of thanks. He waved back, wondering what her story was, what dreams she was chasing, what struggles she faced every day. Maybe he'd never know. Or maybe if his own career took off the way he hoped, he'd be able to help her the way Sterling and Catherine and the others had helped him today. Marcus stood up and headed toward the exit, ready to go home and tell his mother and sister everything that had happened. But first he had one more thing to do. He found a quiet corner of the platform, took out his guitar and played one last time as a street performer with no expectations and no pressure. He played for himself, for the joy of making music, for the memory of who he'd been before this extraordinary day changed everything. A few people stopped to listen. An older man dropped a $20 bill in his case. A teenager filmed him on her phone. A businesswoman sat down on a nearby bench and closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her after what was probably a long and difficult day. These small moments of connection, of reaching someone through his art, this was what he'd been chasing all along. The money would help, the resources would open doors, but this was the core of why he made music in the first place. When he finished playing, he packed up his guitar and headed home. Tomorrow would bring contracts to review and decisions to make and interviews to give, and 1,000 new challenges he couldn't anticipate. But tonight he was still just Marcus Chen, a street performer from the Bronx who'd been given a chance to become something more. He thought about the gasps in that conference room when he'd challenged Sterling, when he'd refused to accept help on terms that diminished him, when he'd demanded to be treated as an equal partner in his own future. That moment of courage, of choosing dignity over desperation, had changed everything, not because it impressed the investors, though it had, but because it proved something to himself, that he could stand in a room full of wealth and power and still be exactly who he was. As he climbed the stairs out of the subway and emerged onto the street, Marcus smiled. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't fully imagine yet. There would be challenges and setbacks and moments when he'd question whether he deserved this opportunity. But he also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was ready for whatever came next.